I'd like to now pass over to the session chair, one of those colleagues, Professor Kevin Anderson from the University of Manchester.
Thanks very much, Greg. So good morning to you all. I had my welcome to Greg's there. My job today is quite a straightforward job. We've got two presentations in this opening keynote session. The first of these actually is going to be a recorded presentation from Rachel Maclean, and she's the MP and Parliamentary Undersecretary of State at the Department for Transport, so someone really with their finger on the pulse here. She's got a wide range of responsibilities, but significantly she focuses on the future of transport, and probably most important for today, her remit includes environment and decarbonisation. So we couldn't really hear from someone better within government looking at these issues. I'm going to just say a few words before we go into Rachel's presentation, and then once we've heard Rachel's presentation, we'll go almost straight over just a quick introduction to Greg, and then Greg will give his principal keynote. But I think just having spent the last week actually in court with three planners looking at the expansion of Bristol Airport, and that of course is the expansion of just one of many airports, some have which have got the go-ahead in the UK. At the same time, we've of course got the recent announcement of £27 billion on new road infrastructure in the UK. We've also got an inquiry at the moment whether the UK should open a new coal mine. We've got the government now looking at new licenses for a new huge oil field off Shetland. So what we see is really, in some respects, business as usual when it comes to the actual, the physical carbon-rich infrastructure of the UK. It's how can we develop that, not how can we rapidly shift away from that. So it'll be interesting to hear how Rachel plays that out. And also, I think it is important to bear in mind that the UK, to its significant credit, sort of led on the recent G7 communique. And the communique was really important because it basically said that the G7 nations are going to commit to aiming more at 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming than the 2 degrees. So that makes the challenge considerably harder. And set that against the recent science report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the so-called AR6 report, where if you played out, say, a 50-50 chance of 1.5 degrees centigrade, globally, we're going to use that carbon budget up in just 7 to 10 years. And very importantly, of course, in all of the climate change agenda since the early 90s, there's been a really important focus on equity, that the rich countries, particularly countries like the UK and the US, who've been responsible for most of the warming around the world thus far, that we have to show some leadership. So that 7 to 10 years at the global level, and we'll be using up our proportion of the budget much, much faster at current rates. And I think that leads us very clearly into the title of this conference, where we're looking at, real zero in a hurry. We don't have till 2050 in terms of energy, and particularly here in terms of transport. We need to be rapidly reducing emissions. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out across this week. So without further ado, we'll go to Rachel's presentation, which I think is about 10 minutes before we come back and then speak with Greg. Anyway.
Good morning, and thank you for allowing me to speak at the opening of this fantastic conference. I'd like to recognise the vital role Decarbonate is playing in helping to bring about a green future. You are corralling industry, academia and government to tackle arguably the defining challenge of this century. And I'm delighted that these 8 northern universities, based in the region that spawned the original industrial revolution, is helping us bring about a green one for the 21st century. And there is no time to waste. As the title of this conference rightly makes clear, and as the UN Secretary General put it, the climate emergency is a race we're losing, but it's a race that we can win. And that's why the UK is determined to use its position as host of COP26 to show global leadership, working with the global community to reduce emissions as fast as possible and to stem the rise in global temperatures. We were the first major economy to set a net zero target by 2050. And given transport is the largest source of our emissions, we submitted our most comprehensive plan ever for clean travel in July. The Transport Decarbonisation Plan is not just a green print to remove emissions from travel. It's also a vision for a future where we still travel, but we do so in healthier and more sustainable ways. It's a vision of a green economy where new highly skilled jobs across the country are created. And it's a vision of local governance where everyday decisions on how we travel are made by those that drive on the same roads as us, walk the same streets and catch the same buses. And the plan, I'm delighted to say, was not created in a Whitehall vacuum. It was the product of years of conversations with stakeholders, including our host today, and it will be an evolving document, updated at least every 5 years, outlining our progress and reassessing future plans. Importantly, it recognises that whilst climate change is a universal problem, real change happens on the ground, driven by local leadership to suit local needs. And that's why this government's approach from buses to active travel has been to coordinate nationally but deliver locally. Because progress to net zero isn't achieved through a one-size-fits-all approach. Rather, it's the sum of progress in different areas. And that's why place-based decarbonisation is a core part of our plan. And let's be clear, we can start feeling the benefits of this approach straight away. For example, lower congestion and increased air quality in our towns. Better connectivity, which attracts investment to local economies, leading to jobs. And enhanced livability, as we start to create communities based around people rather than vehicles. If we can get this right, we will not only secure a green-led economic recovery, we will level up right across the country. Today I want to focus on 2 areas. Let me start with investment. We want the entire country to benefit from better connectivity, lower congestion and improved public transport. Faster trains, better buses and new and improved tram networks can not only revitalise local economies, but do so in a way which reduces our dependencies on cars and other high polluting forms of transport. For me, that's at the heart of our levelling up agenda, and we don't have to look far to see transport investment being used to deliver decarbonisation through places. The Tyne and Wear region will welcome 42 new air-conditioned trains to its metro, thanks to a £64 million investment. And the Tees Valley Combined Authority was the first pilot region to test the rental of zero-emission e-scooters. As well as this, there'll be 20 hydrogen buses gracing the streets of Liverpool as part of the city region's ambition to reach 1,000 zero-emission fleet over the next decade. These essential local steps will allow us to make the national leap to net zero by 2050. Over the course of this Parliament, we're putting £12 billion in the hands of local leaders to transform their transport networks. This includes billions of pounds to boost bus and cycle links outside of London, as well as plans to fund local projects such as high street regeneration, cleaning up our air and improving the experience of transport users. In fact, local leaders will have access to a levelling up fund and intra-city transport settlements. That's a combined pot of around £9 billion to improve local and regional connectivity. And to help residents and the taxpayer get the best bang for our buck, we've enlisted the help of the sub-national transport bodies such as Transport for the North. They will help draw up a coherent plan for investment on a regional basis, allowing towns and cities to speak with one voice. This ties in with my second area of focus, and that is local decision making. There's no substitute for local knowledge, and the success of the Transport Decarbonisation Plan will rest on the responsibility and the accountability we're putting in the hands of local officials, which is frankly where it belongs. Today, 60% of the North is now represented by Metro mayors, thanks to the step this government has taken to devolve power. And the result is ambitious plans, such as in the Liverpool City region, which aims for carbon neutrality by 2040, which is a decade earlier than the national target. We want to see more of this, and that's why local transport plans will now need to set out how quantifiable carbon reductions will be achieved in local areas, with future transport funding dependent on these plans being robust and achievable. This local delivery model is one we've already introduced with the new national bus strategy. We're providing unprecedented levels of funding to upgrade bus services outside of London, Local transport authorities will have greater responsibility over routes and timetables, and they will be expected to develop enhanced partnerships or set up franchises with operators. Funding will be dependent on these new arrangements taking shape, as well as the publication of annual bus service improvement plans. The end goal is simple: by introducing modern, more frequent buses with cheaper fares, which also meet the needs of local communities, we want more bus usage and less cars on the road. A similar model is being used to promote active travel. We want to retain and increase the gains we saw in cycling and walking during the pandemic, ensuring that half of all journeys by 2030 are cycled or walked. £200 million out of a £2 billion active travel fund has already been allocated, which includes £16 million towards a further 24 miles of permanent cycling and walking routes in Greater Manchester. Our message to local decision makers is clear. Funding is available and support is at hand, but only for ambitious proposals that will lead to significant improvements for active travellers. More widely, will make it easier for local officials to make greener decisions. Our planning system currently doesn't place enough importance on sustainable travel, especially when building new developments. We want to change that through our planning reform proposals, including how we can adopt the principles of 20-minute neighbourhoods, where people's entire daily needs are met within a short walk or cycle. To close, let me reiterate that for us to achieve our ambitious climate goals, we can't rely on top-down directives to get the job done. We'll only build a green economy and realise its benefits if we take every part of the country with us. And that doesn't mean, of course, that government puts its feet up. We'll be providing funding, support and an overarching framework. But we're giving leaders and residents the tools to reduce emissions and change their travel habits in a way which suits their local area and meets local demand. Whether that's e-scooters, demand-responsive travel, or even mobility credits that encourage motorists to trade in their diesel cars for more sustainable forms of travel. These are really exciting ideas which we want to see flourish, and where they work, we'll look to expand them nationally. That's how we can make the progress needed to reach our ambitious targets, and that's how we can start winning the race against the climate emergency. Thank you.
Well, that was interesting to hear, and I think we can't really disagree with the key messages there. No time to waste. We're in a climate emergency that we're actually losing, emphasizing the importance of global leadership and that we need to cut emissions as fast as possible. I think all of us would agree that they're actually key messages that we need to take home from her presentation and indeed from this event. But that is perhaps challenging to think how we reconcile that with new roads, new airports, new oil and gas facilities in the UK, and possibly even a new coal mine. But I think actually Rachel does give us some pointers there as well, because she then points out how absolutely key local and regional decision-making is, place-based decarbonisation really. And I think that segues very nicely into Greg's presentation. So without further ado, we'll go over to Greg and hear what he has to say. Over to you, Greg.
Just switching the settings. Okay, hopefully you've got my slides there now, Kevin. Thank you for the introduction, and to Minister Maclean as well. So clearly, whilst I'm going to say that we're not going fast enough, having a decarbonisation plan and having a minister who's as committed to thinking about decarbonisation as Minister Maclean are both a welcome step forward, certainly from where we have been in the transport sector. When the idea for Decarbonate came up around 3.5 years ago, I had the feeling that to deliver on decarbonising transport, we need to focus our attention much more on diversity. After all, our mobility patterns and our transport systems already exhibit huge diversity, and so why should a one-size-fits-all approach be appropriate for decarbonisation? And so we set our goal to explore what we call place-based decarbonisation. And I've been inspired through working with my colleagues on Decarbonate and the people who've come to participate in the network from academia, the public, private and third sector to take that thinking further. I also draw on the inspirational work of other colleagues and collaborators, particularly Gillian Annable, to ask myself, what is a place-based approach and why does it matter? In this plenary, I'm going to start with a characterisation of how we approach decarbonisation of transport now, and therefore to explain why I think this will fall short on the ambition implied by the Paris Agreement and any reasonable interpretation of our responsibilities under that. In doing so, I'll set out the case that we've decided to treat the changes required to address the climate crisis as deliverable through our business as usual approaches to transport policy, and that this represents a further extension of a post-political approach to policy delivery. A post-political position avoids questions of social, spatial and intergenerational equity. Quite clearly, the scale of change required has to be political, which means engaging in encounters between the state and society. And here I'll draw on the work of Becky Willis, who provides our Tuesday keynote, Crystal Legacy and Louise Reardon. And that's where I'll turn to place and explain why it's different and how it might help. I'll explain why it means going beyond the false dichotomy of local and national, and why without this shift, we will fall short of our commitments, no matter how good we are at delivering in a business as usual mindset. So I'll work my way towards the definition of and importance of place, rather than starting from there. And I'm going to work through it in a play of 4 acts. Act 1, science and where to draw the line. So we have to start with the science. The atmosphere is indifferent to the places from which emissions are generated. Climate change, as you know, is a global problem. The Paris Agreement seeks to limit the rise and the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to levels which have a good chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees C. And from this comes an implied carbon emission budget, which globally we're committed to work to live within, as Kevin said. These commitments are then broken down at the national scale. And this has been operationalised in the UK through the Climate Change Act and the budget setting process, which our Climate Change Committee advises on. As Kevin set out, we need to get to actual zero for surface transport by 2050, but also to make deep cuts in the coming decade. To put this in context, there's been a reduction of just 4% in carbon dioxide emissions from transport in the last 30 years. The UK government has taken a slightly fuzzy position on allocating budgets across sectors. They're indicative rather than committed. However, it does result in the establishment of pathways for different parts of the economy. And in July 2021, the Department for Transport's published strategy resulted in this. The lines, blue for business as usual and green for the decarbonisation transport plan trajectory, and include also sort of an indication of uncertainty. And that uncertainty is guided by different assumptions about technology adoption rates and travel behaviour adaptations, which are more or less in line with the UK's anticipated reduction trajectory. Colleagues of mine, Gillian Annable and Christian Brand, have been doing this kind of work for at least a decade to try and understand really what the scale of adaptation implied by the different emission reduction commitments that have been made are. To put this in context, in their 2020 paper on the phase out of internal combustion engines, they found that even with a ban of everything other than pure EVs by 2030, there would still need to be a reduction in distance travelled by car of 20% by 2030 and 51% by 2050 to get close to our goals, with a huge shift to public transport, shared cars and active travel to make that possible. So the combination of science and politics, which gets us to a budget and a trajectory, is crucial. It draws into a focus on what would need to be true in order to be Paris compliant. Again, this is important in challenging positions such as electrification is sufficient or localization and walking and cycling will get us there. It gives us a sense of scale of the fact that we need to act on everything. Here, however, I turn back to Crystal Legacy's point on transport being a wider, a reflection of a wider shift to a post-political approach to governing. The goals have been set well in advance of any engagement with how we'll get there. Many authorities have set sail with a destination, but no map, and a crew on board who didn't all sign up to this and don't share the same view as to the destination. If this were really political, in the sense of representing the antagony between the state and society, then we'd see a very different representation in our climate plans. The reduction trajectory lines imply so much, but say so little. Worse than that, the official political narrative mirrors that, with this quote from the foreword of the 2021 decarbonisation plan by our Secretary of State, reinforcing the problem. So let's take an example claim from an authority I do a lot of work with, and which is working really hard to do something ambitious on climate. I use it as an example of a good authority which still falls short. So Leeds City Council has set 2030 for its time to be net zero for all of the economy of Leeds. It's recently consulted on a draft transport strategy which aims to deliver an absolute 100% reduction in emissions from transport by 2030. That's what the orange line looks like. Business as usual policies, as shown in the green line, would achieve a 17% reduction. In fact, the strategy they consulted on, as progressive as it is, only achieves a 42% reduction. But this is not my main point today. They are not alone in not knowing how to do this, even with the dial on all of the current policy approaches turned up to max. It's the questions that arise from their analysis which show the need for at least a 30% reduction in car use by 2030 just to get to the 43% reduction, and the associated massive mode shifts, which interest me. If this were being treated as a political challenge, then we'd lift the bonnet on this. This is a chart of miles travelled by income quintile over time from the National Travel Survey. Those in the highest income quintile travel more than 3 times as far per capita as those in the lowest income quintile. So what do we mean when we say a 30% reduction? Is that everyone? In which case, the chart would look something like this as we look out to 2030. Or is it more of an equity related shift based on those who pollute the most, reducing the most? In which case, it would look more like this. So if I'm in the top income quintile, that'll be cutting my car travel by 50%. 50%? Hang on, did we have that conversation? That's massive. So now let's look at bus use, which is to increase by 130%. Does that mean lots more use in the places that have hardly any and which are not or are very poorly served by the current network? Or are we imagining that we're just factoring up usage through the network that's already there? Is it all journeys, including those coming to Leeds from outside of Leeds, or just movements within Leeds? What do these numbers imply? For whom and where? Switching back to the Department for Transport's recent plan, the words fairness and justice do not appear on a single occasion in the plan, despite the Minister's clear commitment to agendas such as levelling up. So, when we look at carbon trajectories and lines in strategy documents, people and places are all implicitly there, but they are all also absent from them. So instead of being the foundation and the capital through which emission reduction strategies are built, they are the invisible units to whom decarbonisation will happen. We cannot achieve decarbonisation at the scale and rate required without massive societal adaptation. And I refer you back to the Leeds slide a minute ago, just to give you a scale of that. Implementation is also political. So if we don't upstream the political into our thinking, then we will come undone in our delivery. The challenges of implementing temporary road space reallocations during the COVID-19 emergency or low traffic neighbourhoods is just a small reminder of that. So to Act 2, scales, responsibilities and false dichotomies. The next reflection is on the approach to governing transport and how climate change aligns with that. My principal contention here is that we're very strongly bound by our formal electoral administrative boundaries when we think about policy. There is a major emphasis on the roles and responsibilities of national versus local government, and I think that came across in Rachel's address. There is also the sometimes important, but often vague role of subnational or regional governance bodies in tackling climate change, again a feature of the address. This derives from where formal powers to act reside, and of course, these scales matters. It's where formal politics plays out. But there are risks that we're dividing strategies up on the basis that the scales are somehow independent, and that responsibility, accountability, and also blame best sits locally where it belongs, as the Minister suggested. In a paper I recently published with Gillian Annable, we argue that there is no right scale to think about transport and carbon governance. In the paper, we argue there's a need for a multi-scalar approach, which takes account of 3 elements. Budget coherence, are the budgets aligned across authorities and scales? Accounting coherence, what are we counting and where? And policy coherence, how are budgets aligned with the capacity to act? I won't dwell on item 1 other than to say they aren't yet aligned, but the work of Transport for the North with Decarbonate is one way of improving budget coherence, and there's a session on that later in the conference. On the second, this is a real problem, I feel. One of the key reasons for this is the way in which freight and people move over distances don't map neatly to administrative boundaries. This image from our paper shows the percentage of trips by distance band in blue and the percentage of distance which this corresponds to in orange for personal travel. 35% of all miles travelled are over 35 miles in length, which matters hugely for carbon. Transport has been able to largely ignore the issue of longer distance travel when the primary policy focus was congestion and air quality. Congestion and air quality problems are largely concentrated in our city centres, and so a local authority or combined authority-led approach, where the travel to work area was really what was in focus, was fine. Not that we delivered an accelerated solution to either problem. However, for climate, emissions are not concentrated in our most congested areas. We need to decarbonise all of our activities, not just the commute, and not just those that go on within a local authority boundary, or those that are in our city centres or along our main arterials. This pictogram represents the share of distance travelled by journey purpose from the National Travel Survey. Analysis from Gillian Annable and colleagues shows that 42% of car miles are for holidays, day trips, and visiting friends and relatives. Is every mile up for negotiation in the same way? I think this is one of the key issues with local versus national. And so to the third area, which is policy coherence, and whether budgets match the capacity to act. Here I feel there's too much focus on what is national and what is local policy. First, there are the boundary crossing trips, which I've just talked about. Second, and at least as significant, is that policies tend to have properties of local and national about them. On many occasions, what we mean when we say local versus national is who's leading on their enactment. Take, for example, the national policy position we seem to be moving towards in enabling vehicle-to-grid smart charging. Those allowing the grid to draw energy off their electric vehicles will have access to lower cost domestic electricity tariffs. It will lower everyone's electricity bills, we're told, by reducing the need for new generation investments to deal with the extra electric demand. However, it also creates an incentive for people to use their vehicle as part financial asset if they can smart charge at home. But what of the housing where this will potentially be more difficult or impossible? According to research by William Fitzpatrick at Manchester University, a third of local authorities in the Northwest have 50% of housing which are flats and terraces. A huge inequality potentially right there in plain sight. However, even more interesting is that that range is from around 25%, which would look like this, to 65%, which would look like this. So you can see very clearly that this is a national policy with huge implications for inequality, which will fall very unevenly across local areas. Every national policy has the potential to impact places very differently. But the minister was right too. Local policy is also national, in that what matters here is the sum of the actions across the whole country. This image shows variation in cycling levels across the country, and you don't need me to point out the differential approaches to parking pricing, space allocation on roads, and planning that we see locally. So how do we ensure that local and national are in lockstep? Well, requiring local authorities to set transport carbon targets, as set out in the decarbonisation plan, is a helpful step to understanding the sum of the parts. But ask yourself this: how helpful will sanctioning an unambitious or underperforming authority be to the macro goal of cutting carbon? My key point in concluding on this act, however, is that whilst local, national, and sometimes regional government matters, particularly for their formal decision-making powers and their elected legitimacy, dividing responsibility between national and local is a false dichotomy. Progress can only be achieved through a collaboration across scales. Act 3, place-based decarbonisation. Perhaps talking about this not all being local seems like an odd point to segue then to place, and why I think it opens up new avenues for decarbonisation. For some, place might be synonymous with local, but it's much more than this. So to define place, I turn to the work of John Agnew and Tim Cresswell. In his 2004 book on defining place, Cresswell sets out place as spaces which people have made meaningful. This might seem a bit ephemeral to work with, and he calls on Agnew's work, which deconstructs this into 3 components which go to make place: location, locale, and sense of place. So location is about where things are. They are the grid reference points or the GIS shapefiles which define local authority boundaries. Locale is described as the material setting, which I would take to include the infrastructure, the vehicles, the services, the shops, the fields or waterways, which are at a location. If you were doing an audit, these are the things that you would observe and count. Finally is sense of place, which is one's subjective and emotional attachment to a place. Rather than following this definition down a line of inquiry of attempting to somehow capture this for individuals and value it, I take it instead to be a signal to think about what goes on and why, including its history and what interests are at play, who's participating and who isn't participating, and what's necessary to make that whole activity possible, including how it's serviced. By focusing on what people do, then we bring meaning to the way in which people interact with location and locale. And, as I'll set out, we open ourselves to thinking beyond our administrative location-based shackles. By engaging with meaning and participation, we begin by recognizing the social and the political from the start. So let's jump out of the world of academic definitions and into the real world and have a look at a place. The city of York, 53.9623 degrees north, 1.0819 degrees west, takes you to York Minster. Founded in 72 AD, when the Romans came to sort out the Brigantian tribes of the north, how should we view York? As a location, defined by its city boundaries, we face this struggle in classifying transport and carbon. Do we count people by where they live, irrespective of where they do what they do? Or do we count by what people do within governmental boundaries we're familiar with? If you want to see the very best of data collation and visualization on this, then I would strongly recommend Carbon Place, developed by colleagues Malcolm Morgan.
Oh, hi there. Yes, my daughter's.
Sorry, can you just mute yourself, whoever it is who's talking? Thanks. Gillian Annabel and Karen Lucas, and you can see Sorry, I'll pick that up again. This shows emissions in York from domestic, housing and transport, allocating transport emissions to areas on the basis of all the miles that you travel being attached to the area where you live. It provides some important insights. Emissions tend to be higher in the peripheral areas, and they show some interesting variations even within cities. It brings a connection between domestic housing emissions and transport. As a locale, we can also describe York as a flat medieval city with narrow roads. It's a city which has a network of park and ride sites with electric buses, a city which promotes cycling. It has e-scooters. It has a ring radial road design, good rail connectivity. It still has an important chocolate industry, although no longer in this fine building, and two major universities. We could look at communities of terraced houses, or old Quaker retirement villages, or army barracks. This tells us what's there. It defines the locale. However, what's York as a place? Of course, it's not one thing. It's a workplace for some, but not a home, and vice versa. It's a place of retirement for others. As a resident, it's a place for hobbies and recreation, or for schooling. For others, it's a place of disadvantage, with unemployment, food banks, and free school meals. One person's fine dining experience is another's job. For yet others, it's a seat of learning with some 23,000 UK undergraduate and postgraduates coming to York every year. It's a local town, a market town for some, yet a tourist destination for others. Whilst we can all agree on the administrative boundaries of York, no two people would see York as a place in the same way. And then step beyond thinking about location and place. I wonder if you drew your own map of all the places that you interact with and that mean something to you, what would it look like? Nothing like any administrative map I've ever seen. So let's just think about the consequence of the nature of place and its relationship to carbon with two examples. York has two universities. The average student in the UK lives around 90 miles from their parents' home. And if we assume that 90% of these get dropped off and picked up by car again, just at the start and the end of the academic year, then this travel to and from the two universities in York contributes 7.5 million miles. Only around 2.5% of those miles will be driven inside the boundaries of the city of York. And that's ignoring the 3,600 overseas students and all of the flights that entails. The resident population of York is 213,000, but it receives 8.4 million tourists per year. Allocating tourist emissions, particularly for complex round trips, is challenging, but therein lies the point. As we saw earlier, holidaying, day trips, and visiting friends and relatives is 42% of car miles driven, but it doesn't fit neatly with a location-based view of the world. So are those miles in or out? Are they local or national? To illustrate this, if we look back at carbon place, then we can see the university, which is marked to the southeast of that chart with a black circle, and the Minster and medieval area in the centre as low emission. But of course, as excellent as this resource is, it comes from cutting up our understanding of carbon on a location basis. York University and Visit York are both actively planning for growth, all it seems outside of the carbon budget of the City of York. When targets for traffic reduction for York are drawn up, where do we have the discussion about the privileging of this kind of travel over the truly local journeys? So I would argue that we need to engage with all of the doings of York, the businesses, the servicing, the holidaying, the dining, the working, the playing of not just the residents of York, but all that goes up to make York as a place. It means, therefore, engaging with both the activities that go on there and the resources necessary to enable them. It's both local, but also multi-scalar. So a place-based approach demands that we pay attention to what we're trying to decarbonise, which is our everyday lives. This is why engaging with people and businesses is so important. We have a huge diversity of people, and their sense and experience of place is not uniform. We're not decarbonising locations, we're decarbonising places. A place-based approach brings questions of what behaviours are to be changed, who wins and loses to the fore. What I describe as the political becomes more obvious. But so too does the potential for social capital and innovation, as the companies, sports societies and community groups are all implicated and enrolled in the decarbonisation challenge. A place-based approach will also invite resistance and rejection. But this will come anyway. I think it's more about where in the policy process we want to see and resolve conflict. We cannot nudge or superimpose the scale of change which is necessary. Far better, from my perspective, to engage early and on relatable terms. We also need desperately to move beyond the comfy confines of the big cities as examples, and ask what decarbonisation means in very different sorts of places. I recently had the pleasure of examining a PhD by William Fitzpatrick at the University of Manchester, who was looking at the decarbonisation plans and potential of second-tier cities and the peri-urban and more rural authorities that don't appear very often on conference platforms. Huge swathes of the country where the locale is not conducive to low-carbon lifestyles due to dispersed geographies or a lack of high-quality public transport, or both. Authorities where there's not a single officer devoted to decarbonisation of transport. What hope in those places then for a top-down, local authority-led transition to zero-carbon transport in a hurry? None, I would suggest, in the current set of institutional arrangements. But why should the businesses, communities, colleges, campsites, cafes and farms have to wait for a nationally led electrification programme? And do they just want a new socket or something better? These places have to decarbonise rapidly too. So we need to open up questions of what and how and move away from the why not. There are no other locations who are cutting emissions so fast that they can compensate for a lack of progress elsewhere. So what next? There are many pathways from here. My analysis suggests that we've absorbed climate into our pre-existing set of policy problems and tried to develop answers using the same tools, thinking, and institutional ways of working. In doing so, once we hold the strategies up to the carbon trajectories implied by Paris, we're falling short. And that's even under the fantastical scenario where everything we say must be true in terms of policy enactment and response does come true. I fail to see how everything can come true given the failure to engage with the real meaning of the societal transformation required. This is political, it will be political, and the longer we try and hide from that fact, the further we will drift from the trajectories required. I've argued that we need to move beyond an approach governed by historical boundaries and false dichotomies of national and local, and focus on people and place. If we do not demand that we tackle decarbonisation in the round, then we will box off critical parts of the decarbonisation problem as someone else's issue. If we don't bring people and purpose to places, we push conflict to the point of implementation rather than the point of design, and we lock people out of designing the solutions we need. And please follow the strand on societal readiness in this conference to learn more about this and the pioneering work of Monica Boucher and Nicholas Sperling. Our work in Decarbonate is beginning to open up some of the options by thinking differently. This image shows all of the seed corn projects we've funded across the north. Just some examples. The work at Salford University on e-cargo bikes has not started from a technical description of their potential to deliver last mile solutions. Instead, they've been exploring the patterns of use of different industries and their delivery processes to see what could be in scope. A recently funded project is working on how Pakistani families view cycling infrastructure in Bradford, tackling the traditionally low cycling levels in this group. And my final example, also just funded, is on free ports, which are most definitely locations, but the project approach is to explore all of the local, regional and national connections to and through them to ask what it would take for free ports to also become carbon-free ports. Time precludes more detail or more examples, but you'll find our C-Corp projects represented across the programme this week. Every credible analysis I've seen shows that we need to change how we do things, as well as how we get to things, if our path to zero emissions has a hope of being aligned with Paris. I'd like to show you the answers. I'd like to give you the handbook. We've made a start through Decarbonate, and I hope the sessions this week push the agenda forward. I think there's much more that could be achieved working with the activities that generate travel and taking a whole economy approach to decarbonising places than if we just focus on decarbonising transport movements. But that's a big shift in how transport planning works. We need to make the handbook by doing, and by doing differently, but most importantly, by doing quickly. This is a climate crisis. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that, Greg. Keynotes are so often rhetorical and banal, but I think it'd be fair to say that that was almost the opposite of that. I learned a lot from that, and given that I work with you quite regularly, I think that's a really positive sign. It was challenging, refreshing, and appropriately hopeful, I think, with some pointers of what directions to go in.